Okay. Presume I'm audible? Cool. Okay. I think firstly to frame why this is such an important and vital part of people's lives. Religion is intrinsic to your identity, to who you are, how you live your life. It infiltrates how you think, how you behave, how you interact with the world. It's a core part of people's identity. The moment we adopt this notion, the moment the world becomes like this, it becomes more preferential for people interacting with these religions and for communities in general. Firstly, the model. I think it's important to note that all religions adopt this equally. This means this works in religions with a singular God, but also a variety of gods, meaning that this probably comes into a collective decision within this and it affects all religions. Secondarily, the gods or God in the situation may choose to do this at any given point, whether this be at the birth of a person's life or later on as they proceed through their life going forward. This is incredibly important insofar as it means that this is accessible to people at various stages and can happen at various points. It's also important to characterize here that faith is very difficult to attain. It's something that people have a struggle in accessing for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is often contradictory with various parts of your identity. That at various points in your life, you might feel contradictions between the scriptures you're supposed to follow and how you feel as an individual person, whether that be via your sexuality or how you live your life. Secondarily, there's times at which in your life you feel it very difficult to believe fully and commit into this faith, whether that be times of hardship when you're unsure why God is doing this for you, or during times where you're struggling in general. This means that entering into this faith is incredibly hard to do. But note also, when we talk about faith, it's not just when we talk about believing in something. We're talking about fully embodying and respecting the religion and what the God wants you to do. This looks like not only going through and, for example, living and saying you believe this, but living your life as a God would have wanted, following the scriptures, following the procedures, following and attending church, and maintaining this to a high extent. Three main cases. Firstly, why for individuals in religious communities or in spaces that are deeply entrenched into religious beliefs, this becomes very healthy as it gives them essentially an opt-out, a means of explaining and expressing their identity and having a sense of defense against religious infiltration. I think firstly, it's very important to note that in neighborhoods and areas where this is incredibly deeply entrenched, i.e. religions are very prominent, the vast amount of the community is religious, or just on a smaller micro scale, in households where you have religion very much deeply entrenched into what it means to be a part of that area, into the part of that family, people in general have a vast amount of pressure on you as an individual who does not believe into attempting to convert you to this religion. Firstly, they feel a responsibility on an individual level to convert you, insofar as many religions in general and throughout history have preached the importance of converting to religion, of spreading religion as your religious duty as an individual, to be a good Christian or a good Muslim, to spread this to other people. This is incredibly important, as it means that the extremity and the kind of severity of how deeply you believe this is important, how you as a religious individual believe it's your duty to convert other people and spread God's light on the status quo, you necessarily resort to means that are very traumatic and very harmful for people who do not believe. I've already explained why it's difficult for a lot of people to believe. This makes it an even more traumatic situation. I think it's important to note that in these circumstances, you have situations where people are either just actively harassing you to join this, repeatedly questioning you why you do not believe in this, repeatedly trying to force you into this religion which goes against your identity, goes against who you are. This is detrimental to you as an individual. And in the status quo, you have no real explanation into this. You cannot say that you simply do not believe because people believe that they have the capacity. The more you harass them, the more likely they're going to believe. This is why you do this. But secondarily, there's charities like the Salvation Army that predicate resource giving and resource distribution on you being religious, on you ascribing to this religious faith, but otherwise you're deprived of this. This is detrimental insofar as people cannot as easily opt into this as you would otherwise. What changes crucially on government side is as follows. Firstly, on an individual level, it is far easier for people to cope with this because a lot of times people would quite like to access religion and blame themselves when they cannot. It's quite nice to believe that there's a God looking out for you or there's a greater purpose in life, especially when your entire community is based on this. You want to access these communities, you want to relate to your family, you want to be able to have this sense of relief. And when you cannot access this, you necessarily feel a sense of there's something wrong with me. I cannot do this. Why can't I simply believe? We we alleviate this drastically insofar as now you believe it's God's choice. Secondarily, the people who would otherwise be trying to convert you now no longer have the means of doing so or the pressure to do so, because by doing so, they would be questioning God's own choice. You're no longer villainized for not believing in this. You're no longer shamed, and you're no longer harassed or tried to be persuaded into this particular religion, because now people understand that it is God's choice that you do not believe. Maybe later on God will bestow this light on you. Maybe he won't, or maybe they won't, but the thing is, it's not your fault as an individual, and it's not in their capacity to actively change us. This is why the harassment that leads to a vast amount of trauma, a vast amount of conflict is necessarily alleviated. Secondarily, a lot of religious wars and a lot of religious conflicts have been caused under the pretext of spreading religion, even if necessarily there have been ulterior motives or more secretive causes, whether that be with crusades and more imperialistic narratives. It has been done and executed under the pretext of spreading religion, of actively causing and doing a good thing in the perception of these people, or at least trying to brainwash people into believing it's a good thing through necessarily doing this. When you deprive people of this kind of excuse, when you necessarily take away this scene and being able to say this is what God wants, we're doing this for the greater good of God, we're doing this for our religion, you lose the capacity to pull on people's heartstrings and try and monitor this and try and push this even further, because you now understand that you do not have the same amount of leverage to do this. You have lesser of a capacity to manipulate people into believing that these wars are rational or these wars are something that they ought to do. But note, even if people still do this on both sides of the house, what changes is you lose this pretext to do so. Even if motives for conquering, motives for imperialism exist on both sides of the house, there's a greater degree of transparency when it comes, because you cannot use religion as a shield for doing this. Now, when you do this, you have to actually explain why you're doing this, because you cannot say this is what God wants. This is not what God wants, because if God would have wanted this, they would have done this themselves. Necessarily, then, you need a greater degree of transparency. And this transparency is what allows for a greater degree of accountability when this happens, because people have a greater capacity to call this out now. They're able to recognize that this is not right, that this is not what God wants, that this is not the purpose or why we should be doing this, but rather you're able to recognize the ulterior motives. You're able to recognize the evil that drives these things and call it out to a greater extent. But lastly, in times of crisis, when you cannot access this or you cannot, for example, feel this, you no longer blame yourself. It's harder to coerce these people into this. Your relationship with religion, which is highly personal, becomes healthier insofar as it becomes less coerced and more something that you simply buy in. Incredibly proud to propose.
Seems like in every final I'm in, I get to shit on God and this just won't leave me. But this time, I'll actually win the debate. A few things from opening opposition. One, how you actually perceive non-believers and why you do it in a very, very terrible way. Secondly, on elitism. And thirdly, on exiting the religion and why that happens less. Firstly, the premise on opening government is that you now perceive non-believers as non-believers. No, that actually happens on our side. On their side, you dehumanize them. You literally send the message that God said goodbye to these people, that they're an outcast, the terrible, like the most terrible individuals to whom God, while he was choosing in his bright mind, shows that they are bad and you are good. So you have all the incentives to believe that you are number one and they are assholes. This is the comparative that they have to defend. This happens a lot more likely on our side of the house. Firstly, then, on extremism. So, how is this likely going to look like? One, you're going to be perceived as, you're going to believe that you're perceived as the chosen one. Like the God believed that you, for example, are the person that is for some reason better than the opening government as is opening opposition. And that God literally chose you as his child and then said that everybody who's not chosen by him is terrible, right? But also, religions have a huge incentive, and also they can do this. They have the, what do you call it, capacity to spin this, right? They want you not to leave the religion. I'll explain this in a minute, right? So they have huge capacity to spin this as we are the chosen ones. We are the ones that God wants to prevail at the end, right? Which means that they're very likely to dehumanize and completely shit upon all of those who did not choose to believe and are non-believers and are on their side of the house, right? Also notice, religion understands that you're very likely, so that you have huge incentives to leave this religion. Being a religious person, especially in 21st century, is very hard. You have to follow some very strict and very old rules. But also, if you're a minority group, an LGBT, these kinds of things, it's very hard for you to stay on course of religion. So in order for them to attract you, so you stay in religion, it's much easier for them to portray everybody who leaves the religion or is a non-believer as a total outcast of the society. So it never falls on your mind, even in the split second, that you should do the exact same things. So they have all the incentives to present them as the worst possible individuals, right? What happens on our side in a comparative is religions have much more incentive to portray these individuals as, they're sinners, they made some wrong decisions. But these decisions are mostly based on where they were born, who their parents were, or they just plainly made a mistake, but it's okay, because to make a mistake is a normal thing, and God acknowledges this and lets you make better decisions in the future. That is the comparative. Religions on our side of the house have all the incentive to attract individuals rather than to push them away. This looks like either A, having better policies for example, LGBT individuals, which is something that we see from the Catholic Church in the very status quo, in which they have the incentives to attract the individuals so they spread their messages differently, change the narratives and these kinds of things, but also do the other good things that churches or religions do, like build schools, give money to charity, put money into education, those kinds of things, because they want to attract the individuals. Why would they want to do this on a comparative? Why would they want to open schools for degenerates? Those people to whom God said no, those people to whom the God himself, who is obviously smarter than all of us, turned his back on and said that they're terrible. The comparative, therefore, is much more things happen, much greater things happen from religion to individuals on our side of the house rather than on theirs, right? That is to say, you dehumanize all of these individuals. You dehumanize all of those who couldn't be part of religion because they're, for example, LGBT, right? They didn't want to be part of this. They don't belong to certain strict rules and these kinds of things. You dehumanize them. This is happening much more on their side of the house rather than ours. But also, you're likely to present other religions as terrible more, right? Because you can spread the narrative that your religion is actually chosen by God, right? Now, I know that they're going to say, but this is uncomparative, this is done the same anyways, right? But it is much more easy to spin this narrative when you as a religion have the power to say that God literally chose every single individual, rather than when this is just a random factor given where you were born and how religion was spreading and these kinds of things, right? That is to say, also religions are going to spin this, but also it's very easy to believe in these narratives. We all want to be chosen by God. So individuals are very likely to believe in this narrative, and that is something that is happening more on their side of the house. So when you belong to a certain religion, you're much more likely to believe that you are chosen by God, but Robbie, who is a Catholic, for example, never was, and that he's much worse than in the status quo which we defend, which is Robbie just had certain consequences. For example, he was born in a worse place, which is Rijeka compared to Beograd, for example, and he didn't have the ability to choose these things. That is the comparative that they have to deal with. What is the impact of this? You're much more likely to progress with things when shit hits the fan, right? For example, wars and these things. You're much more likely to stand for war crimes and these kinds of things because the other side is completely dehumanized, because religions have every incentive to present the other side as not seen by God, when God have all the ability to choose Ilya. He didn't choose Ilya. That probably means something, right? But also not going banning the other religion in countries where there are multiple religions, banning their books or banning their religions or banning their churches, or those kinds of things that are generally terrible. This is happening more. We think the comparative is when you believe that everybody, they're probably sinners, they probably chose the wrong side of these kinds of things. Fair enough, but at least this is a random factor. Their choice might be wrong. It is their human choice, which is obviously limited and obviously bad, as compared to God's choice, which necessarily is perfect, and these kinds of things are very important. Finally, you're much more likely to leave religion, and this is very important. Notice, many people do not want to be part of religion. They're either LGBT, or they just don't want to follow strict rules, or they were abused by people in religion, or they don't believe in certain narratives, or their parents pushed them to be in religion when they never wanted, right? But there is a huge difference when you portray this as you have the choice to choose religion, rather than God told you have to be in this religion. So on their side of the house, it is portrayed as if you leave this religion, you're literally going against the word of the God. God, the Almighty, that person who has all the information and knows what is best for you, right? But also religions are very likely to spin this, as I've already said. So they're very likely to portray this as you're literally going against the word of the Almighty, Almighty. Therefore, you're much less likely to get out of the religion when it is toxic, when it is abusive. When you're outside the house, you're necessarily going to feel like you made the wrong choice or your parents made the wrong choice. But God forbids, allows this, and it's okay to make your own choice. It is okay to go the other side. We think that narrative is much more toxic when people believe that God gave them this instruction to be part of something toxic. They're much less likely to leave. Thank you.
The Born This Way movement has saved thousands of gay lives, the torture of many more, because it gave queer people an out to say, this is me, this is how I am born, this is an immutable fact about me, this is not something that can be beaten out of or into me. Shockingly, that has not led to a significant rise of bigotry as a result, because people become sympathetic to people. This is a direct analogy to exactly this particular motion, where it gives thousands of people an out from having religiosity being a precondition to accessing basic services in the most vulnerable times of their lives. Opening opposition stand up and say that this says that God is saying that you're a terrible person. This ignores the model that Camilla sets out, which is that there is a way to find faith afterwards, even if it is hard. But I would ask opening opposition what on earth their counterfactual is. The counterfactual is that instead these same people have been turning their nose up at God. That is the people under their side, which invokes a much more extreme reaction from religious people, no thank you for the second time, as a result of that. Because that is an active assault against the primary identity of religious individuals themselves, where people are actively choosing to move away from that God. But we also say that this God isn't necessarily, or that gods tend not to be vindictive. If you read the scriptures of various religions, it is not particularly vindictive. It is to help all non-believers. Jesus fed absolutely everybody. The problem is here that faithful people, the problem for opening opposition is that faithful people that have faith, will follow those scriptures. But we also think that when you have queer people who are then brought into religion and have God's light bestowed upon them, this shows people within religion that people can sin to an extent and can still be religious. This also has a direct incentive if maybe there are people at the heads of organized religion who have committed similar sins or might also be queer, that it is possible for those people to exist. And what you get instead is a much more progressive interpretation of those religions, because it is in the direct incentive of religious organizations to do this. Note, if we are to assume from this that by saying that God's light is the thing that exists, you presumably to an extent to limit congregation sizes. As a result of limiting congregation sizes, it is unclear why the response of the religion is to be as exclusive as they possibly can be per the opening opposition analysis. Instead, we think it is much more likely, in order for them to have societal or communal sway, or be able to proselytize to any extent that they may so choose, that it is that they want instead to be as inclusive as possible. Because we think it is now in the incentive of organized religions to accept different interpretations. Because to an extent, we are all sinners, otherwise literally nobody would have God's light, and there would literally be no organized religion in this world, and this wouldn't be a debate. Faith panel is incredibly personal. It is something that people refer to in times of hardship, after immense lows, after roaring highs. It helps people make sense of the world. For billions of people, it guides not just how they live their lives, but their relationships with their societies, their relationships with communities, the actions that they take in their day-to-day life. We think this is both interactions inside your religious community and just with people more broadly who may not be religious. Faith isn't just a case of, I believe in God. Faith is following the scriptures and having faith that God will do you right come the end of your life, come the time that you meet them. We think that there is nothing more personal to somebody's identity, than their faith, and this affects all of their actions. It is a lens through which they operate. So too is the absence of faith, the absence of that lens, and the agency that people have when they're in a religion is, if we believe that people are to be born into religion per the motion, or prefer a world where people are seen to be born into the religion, we think that being able to make those decisions free of further coercion in a way that is incredibly personal is the most important thing in this debate, because it affects every aspect of somebody's life. And where it affects it most is at the most vulnerable moments for them and the most intimate moments for them. So people to be able to have this relationship in the most private way that they can define themselves is the most important thing in this debate. But closing opposition, do you disagree?
What reason would God have not for bestowing his light upon someone?
I think there are a number of reasons why God might not bestow his light upon somebody. But I also think that this isn't necessarily a debate about truly has God done this, but whether people's use of why they are religious or are not religious is because they believe God to have or not to have bestowed it. Like this motion doesn't presuppose that God exists and there is a literal light that he gives to people. This is the narrative that is being used. So I don't actually think that the push as to why God would do that is necessarily important, because people can define that in their own way and justify that in their own way that is incredibly personal to themselves. And when they decide that God did not bestow that light upon them, or that they did not want that light, that is something that is perfectly fine. We say that the most important thing in this debate that goes unchallenged by that POI, even though we offer them the option to, is that people can make decisions in their most private way possible. The status quo violates this. Across the world, religious charities and organizations make access to basic services to protect the lives of the most vulnerable people, or people in the most vulnerable times, such as the Salvation Army, dependent on your religiosity. States make access to some of their services, particularly in or in theocratic countries such as Iran, and the UK, I suppose, is also a theocracy. Woohoo! But slightly less so, dependent on a level of religiosity. But also, countries' willingness to allow other religions to worship can often be dependent on you worshipping the right religion or the religion of that country. We think this changes the point at which you have a God that has allowed for this, that is seen to have allowed for this. This is often done to reduce religiosity currently, but now empirically we can say that something like that exists. We also, as Camilla talks to you about, say that it has often been used as a way to justify spreading very, very violently religious messages to so-called non-believers. We solve this in proposition because we show that people's faith is not something that you can just invade into them. This is not something that you can just make services dependent on. You give people a way to have a relationship with God in a less pressured or coercive way under our side. When religious charities cannot just make the ability for you to be able to access drug treatment dependent on your religiosity. Instead, you're able to access those services more broadly, because the reason for them doing this is not badly intentioned. They want to help people, but they just also think that through being an arm of the religious organization that they should do it in this particular way. At the end of this debate panel, we tell you why being able to make decisions in a free and coercive way is the most important thing for absolutely everybody. We show why that cannot happen at the minute, and why in our world it does happen. Definitionally, this is an opening government win.
Skal vi ta det først? Ja, skal vi ta det først?
For a future DCA, Jack could check a little bit on manual, specifically on the motion type section. Then
maybe they can see that this house prefers emotions, don't have mechanisms, don't have plan, but rather you need to analyze why your version of reality and your world that you are preferring would likely materialize in the world that you're living. Given that the only reasons are just, oh, we were modeling this, they're already out of debate. Especially given that George explains, then these people who are not religious but are junkies that are needed of drug treatment will probably not seen as a pure human being, but rather as despicable second-class citizens of which God just has forsaken them. Note that in Serbia we have a saying, when someone really fucks up, like alcoholic, goes to prison, etc., they say, oh, God even gave up on that person. So it is like probably going to be this kind of version. Also, generally when people are going to very horrible stuff, the idea is that God has forsaken them. So usually when God, who is the source of all morality, according to the OG's analysis, has forsaken you and doesn't take you in their covenant, then probably it means that you are not seen as an equal citizen who simply just happened to be not religious, but rather as a despicable human being that is not worth of anything. Now, let's firstly respond to this born this way idea, just get this out of debate. It is true, the born this way helps a lot of gays, and we agree. But who actually buys into this narrative? Firstly, lots of liberals and people who are generally not religious and just have lots of empathy, completely out of this debate. But maybe a lot of religious individuals. But why? Because they perceive that all of them are God's children. Because they perceive that the religion tells them you should hate the sin, not the sinner. Because the religion has incentive to say we are all equal, we should just be nice to each other. These things just actually are easier when you have the religion. But note second thing, the sexuality is not the crux of your morality. Sexuality is who you sleep with or who you like or who you love or whatever. But it is not the crux of all the morals, how you should behave, what you should wear, what you should eat, whether you should not eat, with whom you can be friends, whatever. This is not sexuality. And then when someone is born this way, but born also in this way, absence of all these morals and the crux of these morals, we will posit that likely will not be just the born this way narrative that the opening argument is talking about. They have a higher burden to prove that here. Now, I'm going to talk about two things. One is about how religion just makes people worse and how people generally get worse things out of religion. Secondly, a bit more about extremism. Let's talk about extremism, because George explains to us, which is not responded, that religion sees non-believers, apostates, and all these individuals as a threat. Why? Because firstly, usually they have some political, different identities, and therefore usually, different political parties will just vote for them, or just generally religious leaders have different incentives, etc. They want a country, as they say, that is just made differently and things like that. Secondly, lots of people are leaving. Some people just don't want to buy into the idea that the world is 6,000 years old and that a woman was made out of a rib of a man. And yet I think it's frankly ridiculous given the science that we have. Lots of people will leave because of that. Some people will leave because of mixed marriages. For example, in Bosnia, lots of people, Serb and Croat, hook up and, they need to choose one religion for a child and because they want or something like that. So there is lots of reasons why people might leave, etc., unless there is some strict rules that leaving or that being out of it is bad. It doesn't have to be living, etc. That's why we believe the incentive of religion is to then portray these individuals who are threat to them as a despicable, horrible, and to dehumanize them. But second thing, note also, that the morality, given that it is the crux of morality, it inherently portrays these individuals as immoral, as someone who is not doing the crux of the sources of morality, and therefore it is more likely to dehumanize them. Why dehumanization is less likely in this case? Note that now spreading a religion is very tough. It's very difficult to persuade someone that they should join your religion. That's why most of these people who are spreading religion are so nice. The most nicest people are Jehovah's Witnesses, who are dressed so nice. Hello, do you have a minute to talk about Jesus? Let's talk about this. Or, for example, Muslim proselytizer who just talks to me in Trafalgar Square and say, look, hey, my friend, let's talk about these things, etc. Or Catholic Church that goes, build churches, build rehabs, etc. in these individuals. Why? Because positive things can make people join. Know that many Muslims in India, how Muslims, many people converted to Islam in India, because Islam portrayed them that the world without caste, the world when everyone is equal, is preferable to them, and people saw that it's in their interest and actually joined and wanted to convert. Know that many individuals also who converted to Christianity saw that they can have some positive things, it's a part of nice identity, etc. Because usually extremism, like jihadists, etc., are in minority in the status quo, because for people, it is very personal stuff. They don't want just because you force them. Many people died, like in the independent state of Croatia, it was a Nazi puppet regime that committed a genocide against people of opening opposition. We believe that in that instance, you had the option. You could convert to Catholicism, or you could die with a knife that was called Serb slaughter. We believe that in that instance, many people choose to die rather than convert. That's why religion often, even though that extremism exists on our side, we're not like running that there is no extremist, but often it is not in the interest of religion to be extremist. On the other hand, when God has forsaken them, only their interest to be extremist over them, to eradicate someone who actually cannot be solved. There is no hope. There is no any saying, there is no purpose to it. Let's just kill these bastards. Thus, closing government has an extension.
We do. You missed the motion. The burden on God isn't to prove that God has forsaken you from birth, but that you have not found God's light yet. This doesn't preclude the possibility of you finding it.
Yeah,
so all the
but
incentives for rehab centers exist symmetrically.
Sorry, but we tell you that you need to prove that this is likely going to materialize, that, oh, God has forsaken you, or something like that, and then we should move, etc. But the crux of this motion is also the choice, your personal choice, what you have, whether you are the owner of the agency. Religion now uses proselytization so that you, with your choice, would choose to pick up there. If you don't have choice, if everything is arbitrary, it doesn't make much sense to persuade something that just doesn't work into God's, because it's God's decision anyway. But also, it's much easier to dehumanize and do all this stuff that we're talking about. Let's talk about feeling blessed, etc. If you're already feeling blessed just because you're a member of a certain religion, we believe that just religion less forces you to do a good things, like, you know, to donate to charity, not to say bad things during the fast, not to kill, not to steal, not to do all these things, because you're already blessed and you already get this blessing. In our side, you can also get the blessing. You know, there is a God bless you saying, for example, but you need to earn that. You need to do good things according to the religious scripture in order to gain these things. We believe that we force people who are religious to do good things, etc. But second thing, we believe it's a better relationship of these individuals with the religion. Why? Because then they need something to work in order to earn, to get this position, etc. They see this as a more valuable, as a more sacred, as they worked very hard for something to get that, etc. As a matter of fact, therefore, all the benefits that opening government is talking about actually materialize more on our side when actually you need to put an effort in order to get this, and etc. We told you that extremism, which has probably the biggest impact, is much, much worse on their side of the house, but also the general people have a better religious. So proud to oppose this motion.
Is the panel ready? Okay. First extension for closing government on significantly less religious violence. I will rebut and weigh as I go. Firstly, I intend to flip the opening opposition's point on extremism. We agree that on either side there is the concept of true faith versus the infidel on the other side. What becomes comparative is how you treat the infidel. So now let us analyze the psychology of fundamentalism. What is fundamentalism based on? It is based on the perception that you are in possession of knowledge of the path of God, and that by the extension of that possession, you have a duty to impose it upon others for two reasons. First of all, because in the status quo in Abrahamic religions and others, apostasy is the largest possible sin, which is to say that abandoning the path of enlightenment is the worst possible thing you can do because you have directly rejected God's word. Insofar as you do not bestow knowledge unto others, you have firstly reneged on your duty to save others if you have the capacity to do so, and secondly, you have imposed apostasy by proxy upon them because you did not give them the chance for the path to be revealed to them. The capacity for you to do this instead of God is the intrinsic motivation for fundamentalists to engage in coercion. On the other side of the house, at the point where this is not a human decision, but a divine decision, religious stories which rise to greater prominence are stories like the Tower of Babel, where humans were punished for trying to rise up to God, for trying to take the job of the divine, for being arrogant to think that they can sway the mind of God, directly going against the decision that God would have made and believing that they can do what God has chosen not to do. We see this in the status quo, passive messianism in Judaism. Note that prominent Jewish rabbis have for centuries claimed that the reason why the Jews Jews were exiled from the biblical Judea and Samaria was because they revolted against Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century AD. The Bar Kokhba revolt happened before God had decided to free the Jews. Those are the kinds of stories that rise to more prominence. Therefore, you are less likely to believe that you can convert someone without God's decision being prior to that. But secondly, the element of choice that opening opposition emphasizes is very important, because another concept behind religious violence is the idea that there's an evil outgroup who is not only infidel, but has the capacity to bring people from our faith to stray from that faith and to move on to the infidel side. There are two elements here. Firstly, the element of choice, the ability of the individual to choose to become an infidel is what makes you want to eliminate those who wish to create infidels. But secondly, the capacity for infidels to convert means that you're more likely to demonize them. There is the capacity for an intent so evil that it removes the word of God from individuals. That doesn't exist where non-believers are not seen as straying from the faith. Which is to say that yes, on both sides of the house, we do get dislike of other religions. We do get the conception that their God is not the true God, but we get less proselytization by the sword. We get less crusades. We get less forced coercion, because that is not possible on our side of the house, and it's probably actively sinful. And insofar as we prevent death, I'm likely to trade off less proselytization from opening opposition. The second thing I want to talk about is dehumanization versus the capacity to practice faith. And this is where closing opposition poses a very good question. Why would God not bestow a blessing upon someone? And this is where opening opposition misses the motion. It is deeply illogical for religion to have a narrative which says that God has arbitrarily decided that some people, prior to their birth or any acts committed, are not worthy of faith. Firstly, because people still become believers at different points in their lives. That doesn't change. They see a certain point where a stranger has helped them. Something good has happened to them. They're convinced by a religious text. So we need to adapt to the way in which people become religious. But secondly, it's hard to buy into a religion where it's impossible to become a member of that religion over time. And this clashes directly with the case of opening opposition themselves, because they say religion has an incentive to retain believers. It's very bizarre and stupid to dehumanize individuals who are trying to be observant, who are trying to be pious, who are attending Mass or Friday service, and to tell them, God has forsaken you, move away from here. Especially because as the church, you gain political and economic power by retaining these people. That's why you are likely to tell them that there is hope that God will bless them one day. This is also why you are likely to still maintain things like rehab centers, etc. This is also why these people are still likely to want to do good things, because the conception is, if God hasn't blessed me yet, then surely I must do something for God to bless me, which is why I should do things like charity, which opening opposition wants. This does not happen on their side of the house to the same extent, because on their side of the house, the people who are not observant enough are not observant enough by choice, as they say, which means that they're not worthy of being in the religion and they're not part of our community to that extent. The comparative whoever on our side of the house is that it's easier to stay in the faith and easier to reap the benefits of faith. And here I again want to co-opt opening opposition, because they say it's very hard to observe religion and to observe the rules. This is true. That's why it's very important for you to believe, and this is a literal sentence in the leader of the opposition speech, note, that you are the chosen one. That God has seen something in you. There must be some form of unique virtue, unique capacity for piety that other individuals do not have. This means that God believes, as the ultimate source of all knowledge, mind you, because God is omniscient, that you have the capacity to overcome those struggles. This means that in situations in life which are stressful, where you don't know if you made the right decision, you do not consider yourself potentially unworthy. You do not ask yourself, why is God even testing me? The reason why He sent a test is because He believes I am potentially unworthy, which means you are more likely to perceive yourself as an intrinsically bad person and a bad soul on the metaphysical level on their side of the house. On ours, people who believe get to co-opt the narrative that God has seen something in them, which makes them more likely to reap the capacity to have the benefits of faith without having the doubt that exists on the comparative. Note on the worst case scenario, apostasy. It's already a sin in the status quo. Muslims in certain communities, Christians in certain communities already kill apostates. We do not see how particularly comparative this is. Before I lastly respond to the point on LGBTQ individuals, closing.
Apostates are stigmatized, but also surely people that God hates are also stigmatized.
This is true on both sides of the house. The reason why God hates people on yours is because people have chosen directly to abandon the faith, which means that inherently they have rejected enlightenment. They are evil. On ours, there's epistemic lack of knowledge as to whether they will be blessed in the future, which means they have not inherently made the evil choice. Note in Christianity, it is choice that created the original sin. It is choice that damned individuals to consistently have to redeem themselves to God, because Adam and Eve had the capacity to choose. That's what they're damning individuals to. Lastly, on LGBTQ people, Note the concept that is behind this. These individuals have sin within them. They are behaving in a way that is against God. And unless they abandon the sin, they cannot be part of a religious community. On our side of the house, we get to instrumentalize the fact that there are pious gay people, that there are pious lesbians. Here is the thing. Why would God bless the sinful? If God had intended for these individuals to receive the faith and certain heterosexual individuals to not, then there must be a reason that God had done this, which means that God does not inherently believe that what they are doing is a sin. This allows us an additional tool to re-instrumentalize and reinterpret religious teachings. Note we already do this through narratives like Islamic feminism, where the Quran is used in Morocco and other parts of the Maghreb. Very often this is the only alternative we have. Adding another story to that alternative makes that alternative stronger in the places where people are the most discriminated. We save lives, we stop coercion, closing government.
Suboptimal. Okay. I see. Okay. Yes. Nah, this is fine. Oh, that's true. I'm doing the wrong one. Good point. Okay. Shows that I never spoke at the Oxford Union either. The vast majority of human history has been one of deep religiosity. Our case is going to be that the nature of those deeply religious communities gets massively worse over time as a result of this motion, but also the transition away from religion and towards secularism through the Enlightenment probably doesn't happen on their side of the house. So, first of all, I think that these communities are going to get far worse on their side of the house, for the reason that the goal in the community becomes moral purity and certainty that everyone in that group is a member of the elect, a member of someone who has seen God's light. Tin says, oh, but you're going to be inclusive because you think anyone might see God's light in the future and so you should let them in. Firstly, that's symmetric, you can convert people. Secondly, and more significantly, I think you are much more likely to be risk averse because think about how these religions work. If you stray once, you are damned. And what that means is that you're not going to let someone in who might get God's light in the future, but might not, because that's opening you up to the risk of someone infiltrating your community who might end up going to hell. Rather, you're going to be exclusive and just ensure the people who you conceive of as having God's light from birth are the ones who remain within your community, and any particular straying from that, or any particular straying from a religious doctrine, means that that is seen as like, someone wasn't born with God's light, and so they need to be cast away from the community. And the way that this manifests is extremely oppressive, coercive, borderline surveillance groups within these religious communities. So the example of this is Calvinism, which actually does believe in God's light. Essentially what they do is literally force you to have your windows open permanently because you want to see everything that goes on in your life, because the second you stray, that means you don't have God's light anymore, you need to be cast out from the community. And so I think what ends up happening then is that communities end up becoming far more coercive on their side of the house because you opt for the side of caution, and what that means is that you're constantly checking to make sure that people are in the community. This has two broad effects. Firstly, I think it means that it's absolutely terrifying if you engage in one lapse of faith, and so you're constantly on edge of that, but also you're completely cast out even if you don't. I think the comparative is, yes, you have made a choice to lapse, but you can also always go back on that choice and choose to see the faith again. This is why things like Catholicism have confession, because the idea is that you can confess things that you did that were wrong, gain some kind of peace and solace from that, and then move on from it and turn back towards the faith. It is no longer on your control on their side of the house. You never know when this is going to happen, and so you're far more likely to be cast out. So the nature of religious communities gets far worse on their side of the house. But on to the second extension, I think the more significant one. We think what happens now is that essentially, the notion of you choosing to be religious is really important, also in terms of enabling the transition to secularism that grew over time. Why is that the case? Because essentially the narrative that happens in religions like Catholicism, etc., is that your choice to be religious is extremely valuable because God empowered you by giving you the capacity to err. That's the primary way in which he made you in his image. And what that means is there is a giant value on like choice and agency within these particular religions because God gave you that will. God gave you that ability to reason and to come to your own conclusions about what the moral life might be. And that is the most important power that you can exercise. So insofar as that's the case then, the nature of these religions, the nature of allowing you to choose your, to choose your beliefs to that various extent is extremely significant. Before I talk about how that actually manifests, POI from opening, or someone, yeah, go on.
People to be ostracized away from this, they would have to actively denounce the word of God that tells them that this is part of his plan to shine.
No, that's wrong. Essentially, all they would need to do is act in some way against the scripture, because obviously anyone who follows God's light is someone who follows the things that are in the Bible. And as you yourself say, right, it's very easy to lapse. And so insofar as that's the case, they'll be cast out. Okay, now, so yeah, on the government, on gov, the narrative is that the belief is given to you. On op, the narrative is that the belief is up to you, and so it becomes your responsibility to scrutinize your own beliefs and potentially change them. I think that's really, really good, because I think that the narrative on our side of the house enables people to challenge their own beliefs, enables them to question their religion and their religious teaching, enables them to undermine things like the divine right of kings if they genuinely think that guy is acting against the religion, and so on. But also, I think it enables you to question general other beliefs, right? Because if it is the case that your religion is emphasizing the value of choice and reason on our side of the house, that makes you want to apply those values to everything. So the way this looks like is someone like Darwin, for example, being motivated primarily by religion because he believes he has a moral imperative to find the truth, and obviously that ends up leading to him constructing a theory that undermines that religion, but he believes that he's exercising it in the most important way overall. That was what was emphasized in the period of the Enlightenment, and that, I think, is going to change on their side of the house. So I think what we get on our side of the house are moral systems that emphasize the value of choice, that emphasize the value of agency. We get Kantianism on our side of the house, because Kant obviously, decided that, used his reason to conclude that God was unlikely, but then he also constructed an entire moral system justifying the value of choice and the value of agency in and of itself. I want to be very clear about the comparative on their side of the house, because what gets valued on their side of the house? Essentially what gets valued is more or less an act of randomness, like more or less God just happened to choose you. And obviously, insofar as what Tin says is true, which is that God is ineffable, God is unknowable, we don't even have the way to realize why God has made this choice or made this decision in and of itself. So I think that these emphasis on these values of your importance to choose things, your ability to have agency and so on, those go away. Religion becomes fundamentally a thing that is passive, and there is far less value then placed on your own reasoning and your own choice capacity. You just happen to be born as a good person. You just happen to have God's light shone upon you, and I think that is far worse. Or you just happen to be born moral, and so there's nothing you can really do to change that. Now, I think then, so what are the impacts of this then? I think what ends up happening is that we get a transition away from religion. We get increased secularism far faster, because the values that religion emphasized are the ones ultimately that led to its own downfall as a mainstream, as the dominant moral system. On their side of the house, people don't even have the capacity to do that, because that value of choice doesn't even exist anymore. And I just want to weigh this here. Violence is, obviously quite bad. I'm not sure if it happens primarily because of religion. Maybe it probably happens because of competition for resources. But even if not, I think what's more important is the advantages of modern science, the ability to live a pretty good life, the ability to make choices of your own that are genuinely valuable and meaningful, and a moral system that recognizes that. I am so, so proud to oppose.
Motion. Panel, we are weak and we are wicked, but through God's light, we might find redemption. And that's why I'm proud to stand in closing government. The first observation I want to make about the opposition bench is that they assume that the counterfactual is Calvinism. It is not. Calvinism is the presupposition that your soul status is determined at birth. The idea of God's light is that God can choose to save you at any point in your life. Why is this crucial? Because all of the incentives opening opposition talks about religions wanting to attract new members, are symmetrical. The comparative is whether people perceive that your path to salvation is ordained by free will or by determinism. Which brings me to the first clash against opening opposition, which is why you will perceive that some people were not chosen by God yet. The claim we get from opening opposition is that you will perceive the enemy or the non-believers as degenerates, as someone who was cast aside by God arbitrarily, as Theo repeats. Why is this not the likely characterization? Firstly, most religions believe that God is benevolent, that he is an actor of good. It would be evil for a deterministic God under a deterministic universe to condemn souls arbitrarily to evil. So they couldn't make the logical conclusion that those people who God made evil were just made evil for shits and giggles to burn in hell for eternity, compared to the idea that you are evil because you chose this path, because you had the chance to find light but did not. Secondly, on our side of the house, there is a way that you can justify to yourselves why you are sinning. And that is that there is a countervailing deterministic force of evil, such as Satan. And this is really important in relation to closing opposition when it comes to agency. Why? Because not being sinful is difficult. Because the human nature is to sin. Evolutionarily, we are primed to prioritize short-term consequences. So we want pleasure and gratification now, even if it is bad for us in the long run. That is why we succumb to greed and lust. On-site CEO, where you believe in agency, when you sin, you will believe that it is your fault, that you have succumbed to degeneracy and you have succumbed to a decision that has condemned your soul to hell. If people believe that it is Satan who has tempted you, who has made you to be immersed in sin, other people will believe you can be pulled away from sin because your problem is that you just haven't seen God's light yet. Which is why all of the non-coercive mechanisms OO talks about attracting future believers still apply. You still want to have charities and rehab centers because these are entities which can passively make other people see God's light. You interpret your interactions with those institutions as seeing God's light. So they're not excluded on our side of the house. The only things that are excluded are violent ways of making someone convert to your religion, because you can't plausibly justify to yourself that you have seen God's light through like the sword, because this isn't congruent with this metaphysical narrative of determinism that Tin talks about. So we still get charities that opening opposition wants, we just don't get the wars. And this is critical in weighing against both opening government and CO, because we agree with CO that you do have more agency while thinking about your life. But agency is bad, because most people make bad decisions. Humans are bad at making decisions that make themselves happy for all of the evolutionary reasons I talked about. But if you put your faith in God, that if you stray on the right path, you might find salvation, you might be saved. I'll take a POI from OO.
For an immoral non-believer forsaken by God, is it easier to dehumanize them or to pray that they randomly might convert to your religion in particular?
You want them to convert to your religion in particular, so you have more power, so you have donations, you have money. All these incentives were explained by you. The comparative is that you do not have an incentive to actively dehumanize them because they are less of a threat to you. Why are they less of a threat to you? Because they're not fighting for the same potential believers. They're not competing against you. And this is what Tin tells to you. In Judaism, for example, you believe that imposing your religion on other people is a sin because then you are not allowing God to show them the way you're doing this artificially. Which means you're no longer threatened by other religions doing this, because all religions now have this logic, which means you don't have an incentive to actively dehumanize them as much. Thirdly, you believe that you can be saved in the future because you have God's divine spark in you. You were made in the image of God, which means that you believe other people intrinsically have the possibility to see God's light, irrespective of who they are, because they are all fundamentally human. They all fundamentally were created in God's image. This is important because we vertically extend an opening government by explaining why determinism in particular means you will not be dehumanized, as opening opposition says. Let's get more destructive when it comes to the opening opposition case. Their main push is that there will be less punishment of disbelievers because now you disbelieve, because you believe that those disbelievers can choose salvation. I would like to remind Ilya that according to the manual, this house prefers motions require you to defend the status quo. In the status quo, apostasy is punished by death in Islam, and this has happened for the majority of history, which means that their mechanism isn't true. And here are the structural reasons for this. Because firstly, even if you believe that God is forgiving, you don't believe in the metaphysical truth of other gods, right? You don't believe that the religions of other people exist, so you're not going to convert. No, I already took one POI, that's enough. Secondly, if you have the incentive to have more members, as you do in the status quo, as they say, you equally have an incentive to be violent, to be fundamentalist. And this is where Thin's extension comes in, where he explains how the logic of fundamentalism is intrinsically tied with agency and free will. So actually, all of Anicett's analysis as to how there is more impetus put on free will strengthens Thin framing on fundamentalism, and why the status quo, to retain more members, to have more power, you have had so violence through so much of history. Op has to defend the status quo. They have never directly defended the status quo, which is why the opposition bench loses this debate. But as I hinted then before, you don't perceive on our side of the house other religions as a threat anymore because they don't compete with you for members. So you don't have to dehumanize them as much politically because it's a waste of political capital to attack other religions if they're not trying to compete for the same non-believers. The only viable path that you can justify to yourself is to instead just build more rehab centers and more charities, because that's the only way people can deterministically explain to themselves that they have found God's salvation, because all the other ways will be seen as an imposition, as something that is unholy, and that's why that isn't an available way for religions to spread. I think we win this debate because Thin proves to you why we will have less dehumanization of non-believers, but more importantly, why people will believe that they can be saved even if they're immersed in sin right now, and that other people can one day see the light of God, which is why I'm very proud to win from Closing Government.
Closing Government says closing opposition has to support the status quo, and we proudly do. We're proud to support a world characterised by secular ethics, of non-religious government that permits people their liberty, all amidst constant social progress in a society that values free thought. That is why closing opposition is proud to defend the status quo, and that's why we're proud to get ahead. But before moving on to our extensions, which copped very little, in fact, I think there might not be any response in that speech, let's talk about the symmetry problem that characterised many teams in this debate. Specifically 3 teams out of 4, because we would note that people outside religions end up being treated in the exact same way. Because Opening Government makes a pretty plausible claim that on opposition bench, you see non-believers as people who have chosen to go against God. That is, these people are guilty, and plausibly, God hates them, because God probably dislikes people that dislike him. And Opening Opposition makes a very plausible claim that on government bench, basically, you see non-believers as people who are forsaken by God. That is, they're probably guilty people, which is why God has chosen to go against them, contra Closing Government who are like, oh, there's some sort of choice. But then also, God hates them. That is, these people have gone against God, God hates them. That is symmetric, non-believers are treated the exact same way. And this same applies to all the material about conversion, because Opening Government, because they're like, I don't know, maybe a little cowardly, same with Closing Government, are like, well, non-believers can still be brought into God's light. You can still do things to kind of bring them on side, so you still get conversion, you still get like attacks on them, you still get, for instance, people being terrified of infidels converting them, which is exactly what Closing Government wanted to worry about. Then on opening opposition, you know, on their side, you know, you can still change people's minds because faith is up to the individual. Ultimately, I don't think there's very much that's not symmetric in this debate. Closing government sort of gets close when they say, well, maybe you can have people see God's light later. But first of all, that just means you can convert people back, right? You've still got the problems with conversion. Second of all, it is significantly undermines opening government to the degree that the unsympathetic observer might label it a knife, insofar as opening government spends a lot of time talking about how you don't get conversion on their side, and that directly implies that you do get conversion. But third of all, we just think this norm wouldn't predominate. Basically because, and they're like, well, God wouldn't condemn people before birth, and it brings us the example of Calvinism. They don't have any examples on their side, 1-0. But also we would note, for instance, that people in these in-groups want to say that they have always been special. They have been special from birth, and they are the chosen ones in the community. So they don't want to have some random person who gets chosen by God at 40. They want everyone who has been in the in-group to have been perfect from the very beginning. So let's talk about the one team that didn't make the mistake of being completely symmetric on almost everything, which is closing opposition. We noticed the first asymmetry is that when all of these beliefs are bestowed upon you by God and God's light, we have no agency. We have no say in this. Because, and this is critical, because when you think that external factors are responsible for your beliefs, you never question them, because there is no fucking point. It's like when I wake up in the morning, I don't choose whether I should obey the laws of gravity or not. I don't think whether it would be better if I decided to stick to the ground or just float up in the air, because such considerations are fucking pointless, right? And similarly, on their side, if it is the case that all of your religious beliefs are just given to you by the divine, there is no point for you to consider any of that. And so that means there is never any point to questioning religious authority. There is never any point to questioning all of the propaganda that kings put out, saying that their divine right is what gives them the authority to treat peasants like shit. And it's the point that people say that there is no reason to question the power of religion in their society. No point to question the religious teaching that are against them. No point to questioning what they have to say about homosexuality or whatnot. Whereas on our side, specifically to religion, you are able to get great steps forward on things like secular politics, on things like secular ethics, which Annika talked about, to the complete and disrespectful silence of government whip. So what we give is freedom, far more profound freedom, where people are able to live in secular governments and able to live freely. But we noted that this generalizes, because when you think of religious belief as something that is forced upon you from external forces, you think of every belief as being forced upon you from external forces, or at least it colors it. When you're not introspective about religion, you're less likely to be questioning other things, noting that for the vast majority of human history, science has been tied to religion. It was called natural theology, for God's sake. It was all the one Aristotelian science. But when you are able to question religion, you put perceived wisdom to the test, and you put that to the test in all areas of life. It means that you get things like the scientific revolution and the overthrow of Aristotelian orthodoxy. And this is important because we think you get all of these benefits where you otherwise likely don't get them. No mechanisms for why they get this sort of progress on their side. But even if our stuff is only very slightly marginal, even if it only accelerates social progress by 1%, over the course of 2,000 years, that means all of the greatest advances in social liberties are pulled forward 20 fucking years. That is millions of people who get these benefits where they otherwise would have died before seeing progress. And so when closing opposition is like, oh, well, we don't really like agency, like you kind of feel bad about things, on our side, at least you get the opportunity to feel pride for your achievements. You feel like a human who has agency, but also who fucking cares when we have so much bigger and more important things. Opening.
So noting that this is a narrative, not an actual light, and given that people are religious, we explain why agency before its life is the most important thing in this debate. We are
No. I love agency. Agency is great, and that's why closing opposition wins. Finally, the second asymmetry is that when faith is bestowed by God, faith has to be perfect, because the works of God, what God brings about, are not flawed, because, God is flawed. Imperfection can't come from perfection. Think about it. And here's the critical thing. These communities of religious people, fuck, my phone's out of battery. Has anyone got a timer? Oh, great. Basically, people are obsessed with purity, and what that means is you have a lot of self-policing because you are terrified of people who are faking it. So in closing government, it's like, oh, you're probably like pretty tolerant of lesbians. No, you're not. You just think that they're people who are faking their faith and haven't actually seen God light. And that was Aniket stuff that didn't get that much response again. And that's really critical because even if closing government gets us about fear of outsiders, on their side they get fear of insiders, and that means that societies tyrannize themselves. On their side, people are always watching out for small lapses, which on our side are forgivable because no one is perfect, and faith is a constant struggle among flawed people in a flawed world, whereas on their side, the demand is that faith be perfect because otherwise you're probably just seen to be faking it. So when they talk about non-believers on their side, one, there are just more believers. We get the benefits for the believers too, who aren't hyper-policed. Second of all, the non-believers are screwed anyway for the symmetry problems that we've pointed out. No one wins on non-believers except, closing opposition. But third of all, non-believers are swept up in all of this surveillance stuff anyway. And so for all of those reasons, I think we have to give this debate to the team that doesn't have a symmetry problem, and that team happens to be the one that I'm on.